Hey guys, John from JSP back with another beam swap video. So this video, we're actually going to be removing the j160 transmission. Why? In our last video, we put the beam's oil pan on and went testing. Unfortunately, at the very end of the day, on a second to third gear upshift, the car would not go into gear. After it wouldn't go into gear, it had some suspicious smells, and after cooling down, we were able to drive the car onto the trailer, but something's definitely broken. I'm suspecting the clutch, so we're going to get this thing ripped apart and check it out and see what it was. You're going to start by removing the shift knob. This is a JSP knob, so it's a two-piece design. First comes off the shift knob, then the insert. Next, you're going to remove the center console. Pull up the handbrake and remove the Phillips head screws. This car gets taken apart frequently, so I actually only have about half the screws required to hold this all together. So if you notice that this comes apart with less screws than your car, that's why. Next, I'm going to remove the 10mm head hex bolts that hold the accordion boot to the car. This car was originally automatic, so the shifter hole is not a normal shape. To make up the difference, I just use a bunch of Gorilla Tape to cover up the hole. This makes it airtight and watertight so none of the elements from underneath get inside the car. Make sure the transmission is in neutral before removing the shifter. Next, I remove the socket head screws that hold the JSP shifter to the top of the transmission. Then the shifter comes off. After all the inside the car stuff is done, then the car is raised to access the bottom. I use a 24mm wrench to drain the transmission fluid. Next to come off is the speedometer cable. Loosen the nut that holds it, unscrew it, and pull it out. Next to come off is the drive shaft. I use two 12mm wrenches and one at a time remove the bolts that hold the drive shaft to the differential. Before doing this though, make sure that the handbrake is down so that you can rotate the drive shaft between each set of bolts. Next, I remove the drive shaft center bearing, the two 14mm bolts. After this, the drive shaft pulls off the transmission. Set it aside. Next is going to be the transmission crossmember. First, I jack up the transmission before I loosen the bolts. Then I take the bolts off and lower the transmission down. After lowering the transmission, I move the jack underneath the crossmember. You'll see why in a minute. We're going to lower the crossmember a little bit to help get the transmission off. We're going to start by loosening the top bolt on the steering shaft universal joint. Next, we're going to loosen the 4 subframe bolts that hold the subframe into the car. But be very careful, we are not removing these nuts, we are simply loosening them, and I'll show you why. Because we have the jack underneath the crossmember, the engine should not lower at all. We're just loosening the bolts in preparation to lower the crossmember. Then I'm going to unbolt the exhaust from the header. With the subframe loose and the exhaust unbolted, you should be able to lower the back of the crossmember a little bit. As you can see here, the nuts are just flush with the bottom of the hardware, and now we have a gap underneath the subframe spacer between the frame rail. Here I'm removing the hardware that holds the clutch slave cylinder to the transmission. It's two 10mm hex bolts and then two 12mm hex bolts that hold the actual slave onto the bell housing. Here I'm going to remove the wiring harness that attaches to the transmission. In this case, it's going to include the O2 sensor, the reverse lights, and also the speed sensor that we disconnected and just tied up out of the way since we changed to a mechanical speedo. Lastly, we're going to remove all of the hardware that holds the bell housing to the engine. This is also going to include the bolts that hold the starter onto the bell housing. Now, while every single bolt is going to get removed, I'm going to leave the two 17mm bolts that are directly opposite each other on the bell housing right here. I'm going to leave those just barely finger tight in the end so that I can make sure the transmission doesn't fall off before I'm ready to have it fall off. There's a couple of reasons that we lowered the crossmember a little bit, but most of it is because this j160 bell housing is much bigger than the T50. Lowering the back of the crossmember makes it so that you can get to the top hardware that attaches the bell housing to the engine, like these top 17mm bolts I'm trying to get to here. It's also going to make it so that removing the transmission is a little bit easier as well, because you can get more of a downward angle of the transmission coming off of the engine. Here I'm going to remove those last two 17mm bolts that I was talking about. As you can see, I'm just going to loosen it up, but I'm going to still leave it in there a couple threads just to make sure that the transmission doesn't fall off. After you have the transmission supported, or you actually are ready to remove it, like I've got it sitting with a card underneath it here, then you can take those last two bolts off and you can then verify that the transmission is indeed loose from the engine. I like to just sort of grab the back of the transmission and make sure that there isn't anything that's still holding it. Typically, when removing a T50 out of a Corolla, you can pretty much just pop it off with a pry bar and it falls right out. There's lots of room around it. But this j160 was a little bit more difficult to remove. What I found was just sort of pulling it off in a couple of different stages with pry bars, and then in the very end I found that rotating it from the back end counterclockwise to get the bump that the starter goes into to clear the transmission tunnel really helped to get it that last little bit off. With the transmission off, I was really curious to see if there was any damage to the pressure plate. At first glance, this pressure plate looks like it's still pretty much intact. Usually when they break, they break. But after looking into the transmission bell housing, it's very obvious that there is a lot of clutch disc everywhere. So I'm going to guess that the clutch disc pretty much exploded. Clutch removal is pretty much just the opposite of the clutch install like we did in our first video. I usually just go in sort of a circular pattern around the pressure plate, loosening a little bit at a time. As suspected, there's pretty much no clutch disc left on the backside of this clutch. It looks though that the flywheel is probably still going to be okay after a little bit of cleanup. The interesting part about this failure is that the pressure plate side is actually still in perfect condition. Although the pressure plate looks like it's still good, I'm definitely not going to trust it again, so I'm going to do a complete clutch replacement. This was just an eBay clutch that we bought while doing the engine swap because it wasn't in our budget to buy something really nice, but that's a lesson learned. Here's the clutch that we bought so that you guys can stay away. I think we're going to replace this with just a brand new Egg City clutch and pressure plate. So stay tuned and we'll have another video of installing the new clutch.